my struggle with depression after losing my job. About 85% of people who lose their jobs experience depression within the first 3 months. How quickly everything can change, and what do you do when the whole world seems hostile? My name is Alex, and I'm 35 years old. Just a few months ago, I was an ordinary IT specialist who wasn't worried about the future. I had a stable job, a decent salary, and the feeling that life was on track. But everything changed in a single day when my company announced layoffs. All the plans I had made crumbled in an instant. When I received the layoff notice, it was like a bolt out of the blue. I sat in front of my computer screen, unable to comprehend how this could happen. The first few days, I was in a state of shock. I thought it was just a minor temporary setback and that I would soon find a new job. But days turned into weeks, and I was losing hope more and more. With each passing day, my self-confidence faded. I used to believe that I could overcome anything, but now life felt endlessly difficult. I stopped talking to friends and even stopped going outside. Nothing brought me joy. Everything turned gray and empty. Depression consumed me completely. I tried not to show it to my wife, Sarah. She continued working, but I could see her perception of me changing. At first, she was supportive, but then she started to worry. Every time I mentioned looking for a new job, she would ask, "How's it going? Found anything yet?" Those questions became unbearable for me. Here's the text you requested without any changes. Over time, those questions started to trigger nothing but anxiety in me. I became more irritable, even though I knew Sarah just wanted to help. She had no idea how deep I had sunk into the abyss of my emotions. Each rejection from potential employers was another blow to my self-esteem. I felt like a failure, a worthless person. How could I, a grown man, not be able to find a job? My mornings began blending into my evenings. I lost track of time. I had no reason to get out of bed early in the morning, so I stayed there until late in the day, convincing myself that a little more sleep would help me avoid reality. But reality was relentless. The uncertainty about the future grew more overwhelming each day. On top of that, the debts started piling up. I never paid much attention to our finances when I was working. Credit cards seemed like just a convenient way to pay for something now and settle it later. But when the income stopped, those cards turned into a trap. Monthly payments that were once routine now felt like an insurmountable barrier. My wife increasingly withdrew into her own thoughts. I noticed she began avoiding conversations about money. The tension in our home was growing. We tried to support each other, but it was hard. I felt like I was betraying our family by not being able to find a new job. I was supposed to be the one responsible for our future, but instead, I was only adding to our problems. One of the most painful parts of this process was the feeling of loneliness. It seemed like everyone around me was handling their issues better than I was. Colleagues who were also laid off quickly found new jobs. Even friends I hadn't talked to in a long time seemed happier and more successful. I was terrified by the thought that everyone, except me, was moving forward. Eventually, I stopped checking my mail. Every new letter was a reminder of another debt or failure. The pressure became unbearable, and the responsibility of taking care of my family was too much to handle. At one point, I even thought that maybe it would be better just to give up and end my life. Let me know if you need anything else. This thought haunted me every time I was alone with myself. When I look back on that period, all I see is darkness. Nothing brought me joy. Each day felt like a repeat of the one before. Life became empty, and I couldn't see any way out of the situation. The only thing keeping me afloat was the thought that my wife shouldn't suffer because of my mistakes. Over time, I began to realize that I couldn't keep going on like this. But even that awareness didn't answer the question, what do I do next? I had no plan, no clear vision of the future, just a deep sense of anxiety and fear about what tomorrow would bring. Sarah suggested I see a therapist, but I saw that as admitting my own weakness. I always believed I could handle everything on my own, without help. It was hard for me to accept that this wasn't true. But each day, my internal struggle grew more unbearable. One day, I decided I couldn't keep living in this state. I had to change something. I didn't know how exactly, but I felt that delaying it any longer would only make things worse. I decided to take Sarah's suggestion and see a therapist. When I first walked into the office, I felt awkward. I didn't know what to say or how to start. But gradually, over a few sessions, I began to open up. My depression didn't disappear immediately, but for the first time in a long while, I felt that I wasn't alone in my struggle. The therapist helped me work through emotions I had been ignoring for so long. I started to understand that my job was just a part of my life, not its foundation. I felt some relief, though it was only the beginning of a long healing process. Sarah was by my side the whole time. Even though our situation remained difficult, I could see how she had changed. We began talking more, openly discussing our problems, and searching for solutions together. It was a tough chapter in our lives, but it brought us closer to each other. After several weeks of therapy, I slowly began to notice some progress. The emptiness that had been haunting me started to be filled with new thoughts and plans. The therapist advised me to focus on small achievements to avoid constant pressure. At first, I set simple goals, waking up at the same time every day, exercising, and spending time outdoors. This helped me establish a routine and start regaining some order in my life. However, the hardest part for me was acknowledging that I needed help, not just emotionally, but financially as well. Sarah had tried several times to discuss our finances, but I avoided those conversations. I was ashamed that we had fallen into debt because of me. But after several talks with the therapist, I realized that I needed to let go of that burden of guilt. This was a shared challenge, and we could overcome it together if we learned to openly talk about our problems. One evening, after the kids were asleep, Sarah and I sat down in the kitchen and started listing all our debts. It was a painful process, but it was necessary. We admitted that our financial situation was dire, but this was the first step towards solving it. Now we had a plan, even though we weren't entirely sure how to put it into action. We started looking for ways to save money. We cut back on unnecessary expenses, stopped using credit cards, and even discussed selling some of our belongings that we no longer needed. It was tough, but every small victory gave us the strength and belief that we could make it through. But the biggest challenge for me was rebuilding my confidence as a professional. I began actively seeking new job opportunities. At first, it was difficult. Rejections and silence from potential employers only added to the pressure. But I couldn't give up anymore. Sarah's support and therapy helped me manage the negative thoughts and keep pushing forward in my job search. Gradually, positive moments began to reappear in my life. I found a few temporary projects that helped stabilize our financial situation a bit. These were small steps forward, but I felt like I was regaining control over my life. I no longer felt as helpless as before. Aside from financial issues, Sarah and I also worked on rebuilding our relationship. This period was a major test for both of us. We went through many misunderstandings, arguments, and disappointments. But the important thing was that we didn't give up. We learned to understand each other better and to support each other during moments of weakness. This was one of the hardest periods in our lives together, but it also taught us how to be a stronger team. One morning, as I sat on our old couch browsing new job openings, I felt like I was starting to believe in myself again. I was no longer the person who, just a few months ago, lay in bed unable to get up due to despair. Life was gaining meaning again. I knew there were still many challenges ahead, but now I had a plan, Sarah's support, and the feeling that I was on the right path. Now I understand that the biggest enemy isn't the circumstances, but the fear of them. My life has changed, but in the process, so have I. I've learned to appreciate things that used to seem ordinary. I've realized that even in the darkest moments, there's always a ray of hope to be found. At first, when I began searching for a new job, I still had some motivation left. I browsed job listings, updated my resume, and wrote cover letters. But every time I sent out an application and waited for responses, a wave of disappointment washed over me. Time passed, but there were no replies. Each new day became another reminder that my efforts were in vain. My confidence started to fade. I stopped believing that I would find a job. Each rejection felt not just like a failed attempt, but a confirmation that I was no longer needed, that my experience and skills didn't matter anymore. This feeling grew stronger with each passing day. Apathy slowly took hold of me. I stopped wanting to do anything. Even simple tasks like making breakfast or doing the dishes became incredibly difficult. A constant sense of helplessness followed me. Sometimes I would just lie on the couch, staring at the ceiling, unable to force myself to get up. The thought of trying to find a job again triggered panic attacks. It was too much. My wife, Sarah, tried to support me. She could see that I was losing myself more and more and becoming a stranger even to myself. She tried to talk to me, offered help, and suggested I see a specialist. But the more she tried to reach out, the more I pushed her away. I felt like I'd become a burden to her and that she deserved better. My irritability grew with each day. I began snapping over small things I wouldn't have even noticed before. Sarah could ask me about my plans for the day, and I would respond harshly and angrily. I couldn't control these emotions, even though I knew it was unfair. But something inside me had broken, and I no longer knew how to return to normal life. With each day, I distanced myself further from her. We barely talked. Evenings we used to spend together turned into silent hours, with me sitting in my room or lying on the couch while Sarah tried not to invade my space. Her face showed disappointment, but I couldn't do anything about it. My relationships with friends and family also deteriorated. I started avoiding any meetups or phone calls. I felt like I didn't have the right to be part of their lives until I found a job. Every conversation was a reminder of my failure. I felt weak and didn't want anyone to see it. My self-isolation became another trap. The more I avoided people, the deeper I sank into depression. Loneliness consumed me, and I began to believe it was the only way. I knew my behavior was harming not only me, but also those who loved me. But the sense of helplessness was too strong. It became difficult for me to even get out of bed. Each morning marked the beginning of a new cycle of disappointment. I saw the world around me continue to move, but I remained stuck in place. All my thoughts were tangled and negative. I no longer saw the point in my actions. If it weren't for Sarah, I would have given up long ago. But even her presence couldn't change my state. I felt like my life had turned into an endless burden, and I didn't know how to break free from this vicious cycle. Every time I tried to force myself to act, I was overwhelmed by the fear of failure. I no longer believed in my own abilities, and it was tearing me apart inside. The job search continued, but I could no longer take it seriously. It seemed like all my efforts were in vain. Each day turned into a series of rejections, and I couldn't force myself to rejoice even in small victories. Even if I received a response to a job application, I couldn't feel happy because the fear of the next failure overshadowed any hope. Sarah continued to believe in me. She was there even when I pushed her away. But deep down, I felt that sooner or later she would break, that her patience was not infinite, and that she would eventually realize I was no longer the man she once knew. This thought haunted me, and I couldn't escape it. Each day, I closed myself off more and more. I stopped talking about my feelings, stopped sharing my fears. I was afraid that if I opened up, I would drown Sarah in my darkness. She deserved better, but I couldn't give it to her. My life had stopped, and I couldn't see a way out. Avoiding communication became my defense. I didn't want to hear advice or sympathy. They only highlighted my failure and helplessness. Every time a friend or family member called, I simply didn't answer. I felt so isolated that I could no longer handle even the smallest gesture of support. Apathy and disappointment became my constant companions. Each day brought a new dose of pain, and I couldn't force myself to think about the future. I didn't know how to get out of this pit, and at some point, I began to believe it was simply impossible. Life had turned into a struggle with my own consciousness. But even in the darkest moments, I felt that somewhere there was a way out. My depression had lasted for several months, and each day became a test of endurance. Sarah continued to support me, though I could see that it was taking a toll on her. One day, after another failed job search, she approached me and, gathering her courage, suggested that I seek professional help. I reacted sharply, saying that I could handle it on my own. I didn't want to admit that the situation had gotten out of my control. For me, it was a sign of weakness. I had always been the type to deal with my problems alone. My father had once taught me that a real man doesn't ask for help. I grew up with that mindset, and now it was haunting me. Seeking help from a psychologist seemed like admitting defeat, and I wasn't ready to take that step. My stubbornness had become my greatest enemy. However, the situation continued to deteriorate. I couldn't find a job, and every interview ended in failure. With each new rejection letter, I sank deeper into depression. One day, after yet another unsuccessful interview, I sat in the kitchen feeling utterly shattered. Despair began to engulf me, and I realized I could no longer fight alone. Sarah mentioned the psychologist again. Her words were calm and non-pressuring, but this time I didn't immediately reject her suggestion. I was gripped by fear of the future, and at that moment, I understood that it might be time to seek help. I saw no other way out, and although it was hard for me to accept, I agreed. My first visit to the psychologist was tense. I didn't know what to expect and felt vulnerable. But as the conversation began, I realized it wasn't as frightening as I had imagined. The psychologist listened to me without judgment, and that feeling brought me a strange relief. For the first time in a long time, I felt I could open up to someone. After a few sessions, I began to understand that my problems were much deeper than just losing my job. It turned out that I had long been trying to meet unrealistic standards I had set for myself. The psychologist helped me see how I had gradually become a prisoner of my own expectations, and how this had turned my life into a constant struggle. Flashbacks constantly dragged me back to the past, to the times when I was ambitious and successful. I remembered how hard I worked and how I built my career in the IT field. Back then, everything seemed to be going according to plan, and my future appeared secure. But after the layoff, everything went awry, and I didn't know how to pull my life together. These memories tormented me. Every time I thought about my past, I was overwhelmed by a sense of loss. I was no longer the successful guy everyone knew. Losing my job had shattered my identity, and now I didn't know who I was. The psychologist said that this process was normal, that I was experiencing an identity crisis, and that it could be overcome. But it was hard for me to believe. Over time, sessions with the psychologist began to yield some results. I noticed that my thinking was starting to change. I began to understand that work does not define my worth as a person. It was just one aspect of my life, not its essence. This thought was new to me, and I struggled to come to terms with it. The battle with depression remained tough. I felt like I was taking one step forward, but 2 steps back. There were days when it seemed like things were getting better, only to be followed by moments when I would sink back into despair. But now I had support, and I began to realize that I didn't have to do this alone. One day after a session, I decided to take a walk in the park. I had previously avoided such walks, considering them a waste of time, but this time I felt I needed to simply get some fresh air and let my thoughts settle. The walk helped me understand that life changes don't happen overnight. It's a process, and I needed to be prepared to work on myself. Every time I came home from a session, Sarah would ask how it went. At first, I didn't want to talk about it, feeling that these conversations only deepened my pain. But over time, I began to share my thoughts and feelings. My openness helped us grow closer, and it became the first step towards rebuilding our relationship. Flashbacks became a part of my therapy. The psychologist advised me to recall moments when I felt at the height of success and analyze what truly brought me joy. I started to realize that my motivation was based on external factors, recognition, money, success. But now it was time to find internal motivation, something that would give me purpose without relying on external circumstances. Returning to reality was difficult. My depression hadn't gone away, but now I had tools to fight it. I began working on my perception of the world, learning not to let failures define me as a person. It was challenging, but I felt like I was moving in the right direction. Therapy taught me that depression is not just a state of mind, it's an illness that needs to be treated. And while the journey was tough, I began to feel that there was light at the end of the tunnel. It was important to accept my weaknesses and understand that seeking help did not make me any less manly or successful. With each new session, I discovered new facets of my inner world. The psychologist helped me understand that past successes are not guarantees of happiness, and that life after losing a job could even be better than before. But for that, I needed to learn to value myself, not just for what I do, but for who I am. Sarah continued to be my strongest ally. She was there when I needed support the most, and her patience was incredible. I began to see her not just as a wife, but as a partner ready to stand by me through the toughest moments. My life had changed. I was no longer the ambitious guy everyone knew, but now I was starting to build a new life based on different values. I increasingly caught myself feeling like I was giving up. Losing my job was a heavy blow, but now, with depression taking over my life, I felt on the brink. Every day became a struggle just to get out of bed. My thoughts began pulling me into even darker places, and for the first time in my life, I wondered, was it all worth the effort? All attempts to find a job seemed futile. It felt like every company I applied to had its own reasons for not hiring me. Whether it was a lack of experience or just bad timing, I no longer knew how to justify these constant failures. Everything that once made up my identity had vanished, and I felt like I had lost not just my job, but myself. On one of those gloomy days, I was heading to the psychologist's office, feeling completely empty. There seemed to be no point in continuing. I even thought about quitting therapy, convinced it wasn't helping. But that session turned out to be a turning point for me. The psychologist noticed my state and began talking about the importance of mental resilience. He explained that battling depression isn't just a fight you win or lose. It's an ongoing process where understanding your emotions and accepting yourself as you are is crucial. He helped me see that my condition wasn't a failure, but a new phase of my life. I began to understand that the self-destructive thoughts haunting me were the result of unrealistic expectations. I wanted to be the successful professional I once was, but life no longer fit into those molds. My psychologist taught me that true worth lies not in career or social status, but in how you perceive and love yourself, even in the darkest moments. It was a strange realization, but it gradually started to seep into my life. I understood that I shouldn't measure my worth solely through work or achievements. The fact that I was a person who had gone through this difficult period already held meaning. I began to accept my weaknesses and failures, seeing them not just as sources of pain, but as opportunities for growth. With each new session, I felt like I was slowly regaining control of my life. Depression was still a part of my existence, but I was no longer afraid of it. I started to view this state as something to be understood and worked on, rather than something to ignore or be ashamed of. It gave me the strength to continue fighting, even when everything seemed hopeless. One day, during a conversation with Sarah, she confessed that she had been very worried about me all this time. She told me how hard it had been to see me in such a state and how much she wanted to help, but didn't know how. Her honesty made me realize that I wasn't alone in this struggle. She had been my greatest support, even when I couldn't see it. Sarah became the beacon of light that helped me move forward. Her patience and love became my motivation to keep working on myself. I began to notice how our relationship grew stronger. She was there during the darkest moments of my life, and I realized that this type of support should not be underestimated. One morning, I woke up and, for the first time in a long while, felt a sense of relief. Not because my problems had vanished, but because I had started accepting myself as I was. I realized that this period of my life was necessary for my growth. I no longer viewed it as a failure, but as an opportunity for a fresh start. My life didn't become perfect after this realization. I still hadn't found a job, and my depression didn't disappear overnight. But I began to see that what mattered most in life wasn't how much you earn or what position you hold. What truly matters are your inner values, how you treat yourself and others. I started developing new habits to help maintain my mental stability. Walks in the fresh air, meditation, reading self-help books, these became part of my new life. I no longer fought against depression, but tried to understand it, to give it a place in my life, but not let it control my existence. Over time, I found new sources of motivation. Instead of trying to return to my old career, I began considering the possibility of changing professions. Perhaps this was a chance to pursue something that truly brings me joy. I started exploring new directions, looking at life from a different angle. It was a process, and I didn't know where it would lead me. But for the first time in a long while, I felt that I had the right to choose. In my last session with the psychologist, I told him that I was no longer afraid of the future. I didn't know what awaited me, but it no longer filled me with panic. He smiled and said that this is true mental resilience, not avoiding difficulties, but being ready to face them with dignity. Now I understand that the hardest moments of my life were an opportunity for a fresh start. Losing my job, battling depression, relationship crises, all of these were part of a process that helped me grow and become stronger. I am no longer afraid of change because I know I can handle it. My story isn't over yet. I am still searching for new opportunities, trying to build a new life. But now I view the world not as a place where I must constantly prove my worth, but as a chance to grow and evolve. And this feeling brings me peace. Have you ever faced similar challenges? How did you overcome depression or job loss? Share your story. Your experience might help someone else. And subscribe to not miss new stories about life, challenges, and victories.